Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Alirio Muñoz Ortega Aji wash processed Colombia from Subtext Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Subtext, based out of Toronto, Ontario. And they're a coffee roaster that's appeared on the channel on numerous occasions. However, it has been about a year since they were last featured on this channel. That being said, I have been monitoring their releases as they do have one of the lowest miss rates out of any coffee roaster that we have reviewed on this channel. So when I saw that they released the Copa de Oro winner, the Francais Marin, I decided to pick up that coffee as well as a couple of others to go alongside it, including this one. So it'll be interesting to see how these coffees turned out, as this right here is day 56. And recipe we went with for this coffee was Subtext recipe, which is a 16.25 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 97 degrees Celsius, about 207 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind. Roast profile for this coffee. It is kind of interesting. I do feel like I remember them being a little bit lighter than the experience that we had this time around with them. We'd previously described them as being maybe not quite as light as some of the offerings that we'd had from Say in the past, and I can definitely see that still being the results that we had with these coffees. But when you compare them alongside some of the other Canadian coffee roasters, including September, I do find that the majority of September's regular profiles are still lighter than the experiences that we did have with these coffees. So I feel like the best place to align these ones are being on the more light side of a medium light by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 24, first impression through the V60, and as mentioned, the coffee was just slightly more robust than expected, as there's a slight bit of roast in the finish, at least based off of the first try that we did have of this coffee. It is contrasted by a bit of berry brightness and a slight tart quality that's in line with the listed grape. Coffee likely needed more time to rest, but for the most part, it was an okay first impression. And usually what I get from Subtext's coffees is that we see an incremental improvement each time we brewed it. So this first impression wasn't necessarily unexpected. I fully expected it to be maybe a little underwhelming this first time around, but the roast was something that I wasn't necessarily expecting. Let's go ahead and move on to day 27 as we opted for the Chemex, and the coffee was much better this time around as it still does feel a little bit robust off brew. However, it did cool down pretty well with plenty of sweetness, including a fair bit of the listed apricot quality, plenty of texture and body with a slight Colombian berry quality to go with it once again. So this was definitely a better second impression. I kind of got an idea of the direction that this coffee was probably going to be going from here. Day 30 through the UFO Brewer, and there's a similar sentiment this time around to some of the previous days, as it does feel both the sweetest and cleanest that we've experienced out of any of the Subtext coffees that we were working on as of that moment, with a bit of the listed cream soda feeling apt, where there's plenty of sugariness and a prominent herbal feel to go alongside that as well. So a little bit more of the roast in the finish once again, so still not necessarily the lightest coffee, but even then I was finding some more enjoyable aspects of it this time around. Day 33 through the V60 with Subtext recipe, and the coffee wasn't quite as good today, as it did feel a little less defined than some of the earlier experiences, with a bit more of a generic berry feel and an undefined and uneven brightness to go alongside that as well. Less sweetness, as the coffee did feel interestingly more toned down than I might have expected given the adjustments that we made. Now, I've always felt that Subtext's recipe isn't too dissimilar to our own. It's just a slightly higher extraction at 1 degree Celsius higher and a slight bit of a, I guess that would be lower concentration on the coffee as well. So for that reason, I guess I kind of expected it to be pretty similar to the experiences that we'd had up to that point, but even then, not quite. So on day 36, we did opt for the Chemex with Subtext recipe, and it was a little bit better this time around, as it does have a nice level of intensity and a slight bit of a bitter fruit brightness to it in a citric sense, which does seem to be expanded upon as it cooled down. Otherwise, some more of the Colombian berry qualities, traces of stone fruit, and more of the slight spiced quality within the finish once again. So pretty typical of what I was going to expect from a Colombian coffee, given that this one did still seem to skew a little bit more in the aji-like characteristics. Day 39 through the V60 with Subtext recipe, and there are some struggles to this coffee, as it was lacking a bit of definition in any specific direction with more of the uneven brightness. So definitely when brewing with the V60 at slightly higher extraction adjustments, I did not necessarily get the best results. It felt like this coffee generally had some better success with the Chemex, so we went back to that on day 42, and it was the best that it had been to this point, largely due to the sweetness, as it was offering plenty of the expected berry qualities once again in line with that listed grape. And that's what I continue to go back to, largely because this coffee did feel very Colombian. I feel like if you would have served this alongside a number of other wash processed coffees, I would probably be able to pick this one out as being a very Colombian coffee, largely because so many of these Colombian coffees have that very distinct berry-like feel to it, and this one was no exception, but also a little bit more of a candied stone fruit, which definitely did seem to help, as I was really hoping to get a lot more of those qualities within this one, but it just seemed to be an ever-fleeting trait with this coffee. Brightness a little bit more even, so better overall. And on day 45, as a result, we opted to go back through the Chemex with Subtext recipe. And it's been a bit inconsistent overall, as this time it felt a little bit more tame, with a focus being on the grape berry-like qualities once again. A prominent spiced herbal florality does give this coffee a little bit more depth, but the overall sweetness and brightness were a little bit more toned down, which wasn't necessarily ideal, given that I was really looking forward to having much more sweetness within this experience. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have 3 level 4s. Let's go through those real quick, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. I've actually heard from somebody recently that they said that no Colombian coffees are actually that clean, which is a sentiment that I strongly disagree with. There are definitely some Colombian coffees that we do have out there in the wash processing that can be extremely clean, but I kind of get where they're coming from, largely because all of them do seem to have this interesting kind of fermentiness at times, especially in the berry sense. So even something like this, which is a wash processed coffee, you would expect to turn out a little bit cleaner than it did. And given that it did have so many of those berry traits the majority of the time that we were working on it, I could see it being maybe on the slightly lower side of the level 4 mark, but for the most part, it would be really difficult to take too much away from the overall cleanliness of this one. It's pretty well defined in the qualities that it does offer, especially on certain days and at certain moments. So level 4 where we opted to put that, but washed Colombian coffees in general, nowhere near as clean as your washed Ethiopian or Panamanian coffees. Finish level 4. Had pretty mixed feelings on that, largely because it did come out in that slightly more spiced herbal sense, and not necessarily my favorite trait or characteristic to this coffee. It can be a little bit berry forward, and having that be the kind of lingering finish to it, kind of mixed impressions overall, so not my favorite part. We'll go ahead and move on to that next part, which is the berry fruit level 4. And they have that grape note list on here. I can see it largely because the berry quality is a little bit more tart, but for the most part, it definitely has that darker Colombian berry quality to it. And I never really know what a good descriptor for that is. Usually a little bit more of a red fruit, a little bit more of a raspberry characteristic to it, but usually it's intensified when the processing is a little heavier. So it's just that more generic dark berry feel the majority of the time we're working on it. Let's go ahead and go through the level 3s. We will start with the sweetness level 3. That one was interchangeable based on the day. Now, there were certain days, largely Chemex days, where we were able to get a level 4 in terms of the overall sweetness to this one, but certainly not quite as sweet as some of the other Subtext coffees we were working on, and we made sure to notate that within these tasting wheels so you can kind of see them comparatively. Level 3, where we opted to put that. We'll go ahead and move on to the acidity level 3. I'm not entirely sure if that's a win or not, largely because it was a little bit higher, a little bit more uneven, that level 4 mark on certain days, especially when brewed with the V60. Obviously, you'd expect the V60 to have a little bit more brightness in general, but for the most part, it did seem to be a bit more diluted as we were working on this coffee. So level 3 is honestly fine for me, not the most important part of this coffee. Florality level 3, and I'll kind of discuss that with the spice quality there also at the level 3. This one is an aji coffee, and that was the big selling point to me going into it, largely because I had one really great coffee that was of the aji varietal, and ever since then I've been trying to find anything that's even a shade as good as that one was. So seeing this one be an aji coffee, I was curious to see if it would have a little bit of a spiced quality, and it does, a little bit of a spiced floral quality at that. So both those things kind of there at that level 3 mark. I don't necessarily have a great descriptor for either of them, largely because this coffee didn't necessarily have the best definition to certain characteristics of it. Stone fruit level 3, I mentioned on and off that there is a bit of an apricot-like quality at times. At its best, it did have a candied apricot-like feel, which was the most enjoyable experience for this coffee for me. So level 3, where we opted to put that, I could get slight shades of that towards the end, and the big reason I enjoyed the original aji coffee that I'm referencing was because it was very stone fruit heavy. And then the final thing worth discussing, we have the body out of level 3. It's a little bit more medium body, a little bit more medium texture, even with it being brewed on the Chemex. So I don't necessarily think I have too much to add to that. I think that kind of the combination of the varietal and the origin is probably going to play a significant role, even more so than the brew method on that one. So as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. A little bit tricky. Early on, I felt like this one had the potential to be my favorite of the Subtext coffees that we are reviewing, but since it is the first coffee review of these Subtext coffees that we're releasing, it certainly wasn't my favorite. And I think it's largely because the expectations I do have for these Aji coffees are still pretty high, even though the majority of them I have not necessarily had the best success with. And this one's along those lines as well. What's more interesting about this one is it didn't seem to follow the pattern that we've had for Subtext coffee reviews in the past, where usually they're very consistent and you just see that very slight incremental improvement each and every time you brew it. This one right here was inconsistent, and I felt a pretty significant gap between the brew methods that we did work with on this coffee. So for that reason, I can say that it wasn't necessarily my favorite, but even then it's pretty consistent with my overall results of Aji coffees, where they've been a little bit inconsistent and not necessarily my favorite variety out there. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. It's pretty vintage Colombian in a number of ways. Largely, I'm thinking the body and the type of berry presentation that it does offer. Now, there's something a little bit more unique about it. It is that slight spiced quality, that spiced herbal quality that is associated with a lot of these Aji coffees. In a lot of ways, it can be slightly similar to Sidra coffees as well, so I know that can be a very nice selling point to some people. But at its very best, it does offer a very enjoyable candied stone fruit sweetness, which once again was the most enjoyable part of this coffee for me. So that's kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. And this right here has been a review of the Alirio Muñoz Ortega Aji wash processed Colombia from Subtext Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.